I must apologise for having my head down for a lot of this, because despite what Steve says, the ink's only just dried on this talk, because you keep finding new things. So apologies for that, but I want to make sure I try and get it right for you. Since its arrival in England, tea has been seen as a luxury, an everyday essential, a benefit and a threat to health, a stimulant good, a stimulant bad, a source of taxation and cause of smuggling, an instigator of wars and the collapse of the moral order, the cause of male decadence, an aid to polite and genteel behaviours, an innovator of new shipping designs, an initiator of rituals, the foundation of scandal and gossip, and of course, the harbinger of a vast array of new manufacturers and new merchandise. By the mid-17th century, coffee had been known for some time and chocolate was becoming a popular beverage. So, how was it that the practice of adding roasted, crumbled leaves to hot water, allowing them to infuse, and then drinking the result, ultimately defined a nation, introducing to it numerous rituals, phrases, and goods which changed everyday life in Britain for good, as sociability moved from inns, taverns, and bowling greens to coffee houses, parlours, and assemblies. At the beginning of the 18th century, tea was scarce. It was luxurious and it was ruinously expensive, with some types selling for today's equivalent of about £10,000 a pound. But by the 1780s, tea was ubiquitous. In Britain, retailed in every town and city, with the cheapest varieties selling for £1 a pound. Still a substantial amount, but within reach of all but the poorest. Do I need to convert that currency for everybody? Are we okay with old-fashioned money? Great. Tea had become an essential way of life, and alongside other new goods such as silk, chintz, porcelain, all of which you can see in this painting here, shipments of tea began to arrive in London, first from the Portuguese, then the Dutch, and then English traders. Tea from China first appeared during the early 17th century, probably as very small, expensive gifts and curiosities, often taken for medicinal purposes. In 1660, Samuel Pepys described his first encounter, and afterwards did send for a cup of tea, a China drink, of which I had never drunk before. And you can see here, tea is being drunk in a very genteel, domestic environment. Ladies are there, music's being played, a servant carrying in a hot kettles of water, if you can just make out there, nice mahogany tea table there, all very pleasant and genteel. So what types of tea were available to the English consumer? Tea is made from the leaves of the evergreen shrub Camellia sinensis, of which we have extending varieties at the top of the estate here. Altering the soil, climate, cultivation and preparation of the leaves led to over 800 types of tea being known in China. But the European market and later the American markets generally imported 3 broad types. They were fully fermented tea, where the leaves were allowed to oxidize before being roasted, and that was favoured throughout the British Empire. A semi-fermented tea, such as an oolong, and that was popular in North America, and a completely unfermented green tea, preferred around the Mediterranean, and becoming increasingly popular here now as well. 18th century tea was quite different from the tea we normally consume, where we're used to a fairly dark tannic brew that goes brown quite quickly, is quite strong quite quickly, and is normally taken with milk. Early 18th century tea was almost always one of the green teas, the semi-fermented or the unfermented type. And they'd got various names such as Bing, Hisson, imperial. And if they didn't go for those unfermented teas, they went for the ready brown bohea teas, such as oolong and pekoe. Now these had different statuses, different costs, different flavours. This is a price list from about 1750, when 10 shillings equated to about 8 days' labour. So it gives you a sense of the cost of some of the teas and how nuanced and complex taking tea and getting the right tea for the right occasion was quickly becoming. The initial high cost of tea meant it was only accessible to the upper classes, and its status had been further enhanced when it was introduced really to England through Catherine of Braganza, the Portuguese queen consort of Charles II. She brought the rituals of tea drinking to the English royal court, but from there it quickly began to spread to wider parts of society. Paradoxically, tea first began to appear in bulk in the newly expanding coffee houses. Originally imported through the port of Mocha, by the middle of the 17th century, coffee was well known in England. The first coffee houses were opened in Oxford around 1651 and very quickly spread to London and other large cities. Coffee houses soon became modish meeting places for men about town, where they would meet, read the news sheets, discuss business and politics, exchange ideas and gossip. And soon these particular coffee houses began to develop their own specialities of clientele. So, for example, politicians would meet at White's, lawyers at the Rainbow near the Inner Temple, artists at Old Slaughter, and around 1680, one Edward Lloyd set up his Lloyd's Coffee House for shipping and merchants, and we now know that as Lloyd's of London. And you can see here, there's a sort of a winter scene, pretty much on a night we've got today. There's one lady serving with a very high hat and wig in a little booth there. These are the coffee pots keeping warm. Notice this huge urn above the fire. That's probably got tea in it. And they're sitting around with their clay pipes. They've got newspapers, they've got dishes of tea and coffee round about here. Coffee houses often had rules. Very often you had to pay an entrance fee. Once you were in, you could drink as much tea or coffee as you liked, but one of the rules in many of them was you had to sit on the next available seat, and that meant you would mix with all sorts of different people. And they were divided politically, so the newspapers would either be Whig or they'd be Tory, and that was another aspect of which coffee house you'd go to. If you lived out in Wentworth Woodhouse, you would have your post delivered to a particular coffee house in London so it could be collected there. Post would be delivered there. So there were real centres of news, comment and what was going off in the world. At the time of the Restoration, the British drank 10 times as much coffee as tea, but increasing supplies and falling costs meant by 1730 that position had been reversed. By 1660, sufficient quantities of tea were being sold in coffee houses for it to be taxed, not by the weight of beans, but at 8p a gallon. And what they did is that they'd brew that very large pot of tea in the morning, get it going, they'd decant it into barrels, they'd store it in the barrels, it would be assessed for tax, and then they'd keep them reheated throughout the day, and then you'd come in and buy tea that had been on the go for several hours. No milk, no sugar, it blew your head off. The result was strong, dark, and extremely bitter. And like coffee, and to some degrees chocolate, it was a huge stimulant to conversation, because in varying degrees, tea, coffee and chocolate introduced a society to this new concept of caffeine. And it was very quickly noted, tea overcometh superfluous sleep, prevent sleepiness in general, so that without trouble, whole nights may be spent in study without hurt to the body. With so much conversation and access to news, coffee houses became viewed as quite suspicious places, as hotbeds of political intrigue. And in 1674, during the reign of Charles II, attempts were made to close them down, but too late. Coffee houses, the domain of men, numbered over 3,000 and were a key part of everyday life. Because of its initial rarity and expense, tea was first classed as a medicinal compound. In 1658, an advert in a London newspaper announced that excellent and by all physicians approved China drink called by the Chineans cha, by other nations te, alias tea, is sold at the Sultanese Head, a coffee house, by the Royal Exchange. Around the same time, Thomas Garraway began selling tea, in leaf and drink, made according to the directions of the most knowing merchants and travellers to those eastern countries. And a London broadsheet attributed to Garraway, attributed to him its great benefits. Tea maketh the body active and lusty, strengthening the muscles and sinews, helpeth headache, giddiness, is very good against the stone and gravel, cleanses the kidneys and uteries, prevents agues, surfeits, fevers, cureth colds, dropsies and scurvies. While some extolled its virtues, others felt tea could be harmful to those of a delicate nature or if taken in the wrong circumstances. This is an extract of a big discourse written by a chap called Dr. Thomas Short. He wrote it in 1730. He was a Scot, but he practiced in Sheffield. And this is a key go-to document for understanding how the 18th century understood tea. And he describes it in the minutest detail, how it's collected, roasted, how long it's roasted. It's roasted at night sometimes it's roasted for 24 hours, sometimes it's not. He experiments, he distills it into oil, he takes it with various compounds, he analyses it utterly and completely. So he published this extensive dissertation on the production and consumption of tea, offering both sides of the debate. And very soon we're starting to see tea was considered a bit of a dubious suspect. What really does it do for society? So first of all, he lists the ailments it could cure, similar to Garraway's, and you can see here dizziness, pain of the head, dropsy, able to restore sight, opens the bowels, cures a hot liver, cheers the heart, drives away fear, appeases gripings and wind in the gut, strengthens memory, and sharpens the wit. There are some others, but they're too gruesome to go into, so I stuck with these. But he also noted that in other cases, tea could cast some into fits of the vapours. It caused them to suffer from tremors, that's probably high on caffeine, and affected their complexions, nerves and spirits, but so much so that they feared death. So he's trying to explain, well, why is this? And he comes up with various reasons. One of them, he expressed contemporary fears about unknown goods from foreign lands. Has it got some disease in it? Coming from China, I mean, we're talking about an open door here at the moment, aren't we? What else is new? But it was this new thing. Is it safe for people in a different part of the world to consume and drink? Maybe, maybe not. Do we drink the wrong one for what we actually need? Those green teas or those black teas? Are we drinking the wrong one as a possible cure? Perhaps we're drinking too much or at the wrong time. Or is it that the wrong sex and the wrong age and the wrong constitution are dealing with it? And what it shows here is they're exploring What is this foreign substance? What really is in it? What really does it do to us? Is it some cunning plan we should be all aware of? Discuss. Is it a difference between the sexes? Is it the difference between your individual constitution? But bear in mind, medicine in Britain at this time was still based on the 4 humours, yellow and black bile, blood and phlegm. And it was all about getting those in balance. There were more problems. Of much concern was tea's ability to weaken the moral fibre and masculinity of the nation. Tea, it was feared, would cause men to become effeminate, languid and feeble dandies. Men who were overly concerned with their appearance rather than becoming respectable members of society. This is a cartoon by Robert Cruikshanks in 1818, and it shows 2 men taking tea in the fine dress of a dandy. And that's a high collar, cravats, brushed back hair, broad shoulders, slim waists and yellow gloves. Very, very particular about their appearance. In contrast, their accommodation is a cramped, sparsely furnished and dilapidated garret with a ragged tablecloth. It's got broken china, and it's difficult to see, but here is a bed turned upright and pushed against the wall with the bedding hanging off it to make room for a tea table with its ragged cloth here. But the point it's making is that external appearances were becoming more important to some men than the sincere values that underpinned respectability. Society was in peril. Others claimed that tea becoming more widely available would undermine the strength and morality of the working classes. This 1756 image shows a child here about to be scolded because it's unsupervised and it's about to knock over scalding water all over itself because its parents, the family, are so absorbed with drinking tea and they've spent all the money on tea rather than proper food, so they're very thin and ragged and underfed. Here we've got smugglers bringing tea in, and I don't know if you can just see here there's a building falling down, and that's an inn falling into collapse because no one's going there. And of course inns represent traditional values and morals, and they're falling into ruin because of this terrible habit of taking tea. Whilst tea, coffee and chocolate were consumed by both sexes, women were excluded from male public spaces such as coffee houses. So they turned to taking tea at home, in part because it was easier to prepare there than other beverages, and possession of the equipage required to make a good cup of tea conveyed a fashionable and genteel status upon the owner. It was also an opportunity for female friends to meet and socialise, just as men did in coffee houses. However, even worse than the fear of social and moral collapse was the fear that afternoon tea parties would empower women and leave scandalous conversation unchecked by more rational male guests. That's, of course, when they weren't being dandies. You can't have it both ways. This is a 1710 engraving, and you can tell a lot of thought and effort has gone into making this engraving with all this poetry that goes with it underneath. And it's called the tea table. And at first glance, it just looks like a group of fairly well-to-do ladies sitting around a table having tea. There's tea things in this niche up here. There's a book opened and it's entitled Chit Chat, which was a Georgian term for sort of gossip. But then you start to look a little more closely. Underneath here is a demon. This is envy driving out truth and wisdom. These are 2 chaps eavesdropping. This one, I can't decide which way this one goes. This is a painting of a vicar with a woman over his shoulder carrying her into church. Now you can take that 2 ways. but we're taking it as he's trying to drag immoral women back to church. And the engraved lines below berate women for their love of gossip and inability to follow the 9th commandment, forbidding one to bear witness against one's neighbour. And some of the lines here include, Currant, that's this lady with the back to you, has the chair and deals the tea in scandal, none more eloquent than she. And another line, this Livia, another one of the ladies, saw and heard with envy straight, she turning speaks her well-dissembled spite. No lover of women, in his poem Journal of a Modern Lady, written in 1728, Jonathan Swift claimed taking tea with a noisy clan of women exemplified pride, scandal, hypocrisy, scurrility, malice, running out of fingers, vanity, impudence, affectation, and ignorance. Satirical cartoons against all female tea parties became commonplace. This is a very famous one. Again, it's a Cruikshank, and it's called A Curious Junto of Slandering Elves, or Listeners Seldom Hear Good of Themselves. And this is a late arriving guest. They've all started, and they're talking about her, and they're having a real good time. And books down here are the Morning Chronicle and newspapers and all this sort of thing. So they've been taking in all the news that's available to them about the nation and about family and friends and neighbours. And they're so absorbed. She's got a hearing trumpet here to make sure she can hear, a parrot about to fly off and spread the gossip everywhere. And there's a tea urn, and they're so absorbed it's overflowing the teapot and all the water's going onto the floor. And there's at least 3 cats here, epitome of female bad habits and practices. There's one there, there's a couple under this table. And this poor late arriving guest is mortified to overhear what she's hearing her so-called friends say about her. And the moral here is, not only should men fear women's gossip, but this was a warning that tried to unnerve women about whom they may trust. Better not to meet at all than risk one's reputation to scandal mongers. Some women, though, most notably as an example, the Blue Stocking Society, founded in the 1750s, took great advantage of tea gatherings to form groups of highly intellectual and influential groups eager to discuss the arts, politics, and literature. Founding members of the Blue Stocking Society included Angelica Kaufman, artist, Elizabeth Montagu, richest woman in England and a fabulous networker, Mary Delaney, artist and friend of Handel, Catherine Macaulay, the first female historian, and Elizabeth Carter, a polymath. She used to translate Greek as she baked, apparently, as you do. Their salons and tea parties were not exclusively female gathering. Lord Rockingham's friend, Edmund Burke, was a frequent attendee, as was Samuel Johnson, Joshua Reynolds, David Garrick, and Horace Walpole. This painting of 1750 shows leading members depicted as the 9 muses of Greek mythology, each presiding over a different art, literature, music, painting, that sort of thing, showing that they were highly educated, articulate, intelligent women. And some of the faces represent some of the names of those people I've just mentioned. But even with such a prestigious group, they couldn't resist. They couldn't resist. This is a cartoon by Thomas Rowlandson, and he took delight in depicting these misogynistic views of the day, depicting the Blue Stockings as a group of competitive, argumentative harridans, rather than seeing them as muses and proponents of the arts. Tea was a threat to the social order. It could also be a hefty threat to the pocket. When we make a cup of tea today, the equipment generally includes little more a kettle of boiling water, a mug with a tea bag, a spoon, maybe milk, maybe not. In the 18th century, it was a rather more complex affair, with much of the cost in taking tea invested in the correct equipage. And I've just listed some of the things you needed to have a proper cup of tea in the middle of the 18th century. And I was delighted when you came in to see there were sugar cubes and proper sugar tongs. That was great, rather than just normal sugar. But it was a serious business. The wood was mahogany, not just any old wood. It was fine woods, mahoganies. Later on it became walnuts. These are silver. Later on became silver plate. Matching sets of spoons. Bread and butter knives. Bread and butter was ubiquitous with having tea. This is a Chelsea tea service. Teapot here, milk jug, slop bowl there, caddy for keeping tea in there, all with the accompanying spoons. And it could go on and on and on with the tea urns, the kettle, the lamp, the stand, and all sorts of things, the caddies, the nippers, the sugar loaf that came in a big cone and had to be broken into lumps before you could use it in the sugar bowl. So it was a serious business. And by the middle of the 18th century, these rituals had evolved into complex social events whose goods were able to convey gentility, politeness, wealth, and sophistication through their use of materials, mahogany, silver, and porcelain in fashionable and modish styles. The cost of tea meant theft was a constant fear. Sorry, let me move that on. So lockable caddies in a wide range of exotic styles became popular. They enabled it to be kept under lock and key, but still on show, and it demonstrated the household's status. And there are some accounts of people parading round gardens in London, Vauxhall Gardens, which were terribly fashionable in the 18th century, on Sunday afternoons, and some ladies would take their tea caddies for a walk and have them under, oh, I'd forgotten I was carrying this, have you noticed? And it's got this and it's got that, and they've got boo here and they've got hiss and all sorts of things inside it. And that's why a lot of them are sort of sarcophagus shaped, because they would then fit more comfortably under your arm. Let's go back. At first, the tea goods coming into Britain and into Holland and Portugal and other countries copied the styles and the shape and the materials of the Chinese wares that they were bringing across with tea, and that informed a curious audience how to prepare the delicate tea leaves. China teapots were often unglazed red earthenware. This is one of the earliest teapots here. And more often later on in a blue and white gaze, you can see this is an earthenware one, and it's got a little stand where it could be heated here. These are coloured glazes, and there's a cup and saucer there. Porcelain, which these were made from, extremely prized in Europe because we couldn't make it. We could only at that time make a series of sort of soft pastes. And it wasn't until 1710 when the Meissen factory found a way of making a hard paste porcelain that these sorts of styles began to be copied in Europe, with each country developing their own particular take and Chinese goods. So teapots and early cups were very small, for example. This teapot is about 4 inches high, tiny. The cups, tiny again. They'd hold 3 to 4 tablespoons of tea. And so it was not uncommon for, say, at any one sitting, you'd consume 12 to 18 cups of tea. The widespread popularity of blue and white first originated in China, and that was brought across by the Portuguese and the Dutch traders. And from around 1600, in Delft, in Holland, they began to imitate imported teawares in their popular blue and white style. Although their glaze, as you can see here, at that time was a tin glaze, and it couldn't equal that hard porcelain of the Chinese. And that's partly possibly where the saying warm the pot comes from, because some of these glazes weren't strong enough to take boiling water, so you warm the pot first to prevent thermal shock and your tea exploding all over the place. Having just spent several pounds on buying it, you didn't want to lose such a precious commodity. So you can see blue and white starting to become extremely popular, and slowly more polychrome colours start to come in as well. And you can see here a lovely painting, and it shows the end of a tea party, and it looks as though they've had quite a good time. Matching sets were very important. Now you're getting polychrome colours coming along here, and these are European imitations of Chinese scenes being painted. It's sitting, you can just make out on a toll, a tin tray, but it's got a beautiful Japanese black lacquer with all Japanese or Chinese scenes on it. It's got 6 cups and saucers, a teapot, a sugar bowl, a milk jug, a caddy with some extra supplies of tea. Here, sound horrible, it's a slop bowl, and that's where you poured the dregs, because obviously you've got tea leaves coming through when you poured your tea, and that's where you put the dregs in when you wanted another cup of tea. There are tea tongs, you can just sugar tongs you can just make out there, and the remnants of bread and butter. Small cups, no handles, required very careful handling, and some consumers had to extend the little finger, which is where that came in, because the cups were so small and delicate. Notice too, which we'll mention in a moment, they look quite untidy. All these teaspoons have been left in the cups. As can be seen, Chinese motifs were at first in great demand by both consumers and sellers of this exotic new drink, as it gave their ware status and linked them to a strange and glamorous country. A few of the more entrepreneurial dealers and wholesalers went as far as providing display and trade cards for their distributors to add their own details. Twinings, still on the go today, were established in 1706 in London. They were importers and wholesalers. They had a huge warehouse in London. And they would buy tea from the East India Trading Company. It would come up the Thames on barges after being unloaded further down. And there were big tea warehouses all along the docks where tea would be auctioned and bought. And Twinings was one of the early warehouses. And then smaller firms up and down the country would buy from Twinings and sell it in their shops. And because it was good quality tea, advertising helped. So you've got this Chinaman advertising its Twinings, but actually this is being sold at the post office in Bury. And they'd put their own name. You've got John Deck there, post office Bury, selling fine teas that he's got from Twinings, an assurance of quality. And up and down the country, other manufacturers were quick to take advantage of the new market for hot drinks, and they began to increase the range of both designs and goods consumers could buy to enhance their tea rituals. Rockingham Tea Services. Around 1745, the Bramwells began making fashionable pottery at their nearby Swinton Works on Lord Rockingham's estate here. When they ran into financial difficulty, it became renamed the Rockingham Works to acknowledge the support given by the Fitzwilliams. And you can see the Wentworth Fitzwilliam crest of the griffin was used as their trademark on the bottom of their chinaware. And you can see very wide-ranging designs. Here, it's typical blue and white, imitating those Chinese scenes. Here, it's a more sort of exuberant, flamboyant Rococo style. In Sheffield, caddy spoons, teapots, sugar casters, milk jugs, teaspoons, kettles, stands, amongst the huge range of goods that started to be produced. First of all in solid silver, and then from about 1743, with Thomas Bolsover's invention of silver plate, what became known as Sheffield plate, the market just exploded because these goods became affordable and accessible, made in greater quantities far more cheaply to far, far more people. And this is a lovely advert taken from the Sheffield Public Advertiser of 1768, where Isaac Cousins is proudly announcing all the goods he's got for sale in his shop. And it's not just tea goods, he's got drinking glasses and stonewares and all sorts of things. He's got goods from London, from Birmingham, from Sheffield, foreign china, as well as English china, a huge range of goods he's got for sale there, largely promoted by tea. In another case here, this is again about the same time, about 1761, 1765. This is a trade card again from Sheffield, from a cabinet maker and upholsterer, William Hall, on High Street. And he's written a receipt on it to a Joseph Spooner, who was probably grandson of Thomas Spooner, who'd been master cutler in the early 18th century. But you can see all around the edge, teapot up here, tea tables, Chinese styles, and some Rococo cropping in as well. Tea stand and kettle there, tea caddy. How important tea was for these new factories, shops, businesses growing up in the 18th century. How they were used and held was just as important as owning them. As the coffee house culture of the early 18th century began to decline, taking tea in the home offered new forms of sociability for family and friends, regardless of sex. And if you were really affluent, it wasn't enough to own the goods and drink them and be seen to be drinking and using them properly. You had to have a painting showing you owning the goods and drinking them properly and using them properly. And Richard Collins did sort of conversation pieces. These are two paintings of the same year, and at first it looks to be the same painting. But if you look really hard, the lady's clothes, and that's about it, and the positioning of the children are just slightly different. So he's whacking these paintings out. But one's called A Family of Three at Tea, and the other one A Tea Party. And it shows families taking tea at home and displaying their cultural prosperity through the elaborate nature of their tea things. Both women have got very good quality silk dresses on, and they've got delicate laces and cuffs. The men have got unbuttoned shirts on and hats, soft velvet hats. They were called banyans, and that shows they were men of leisure. They didn't have to work. And they're proclaiming their status as gentlemen. The children are fashionably dressed, and if you look hard, you can see the lady here, little finger extended, but the man is holding the bowl in his hand like that. His little girl is holding it like that. There are different ways of holding these dishes because there were no handles and they were tiny. So both families are not only owning the goods, they're showing the polite and genteel way to use them. Remember those teaspoons in the empty cups? As time progressed, cups became larger and the etiquette around using all this equipage available more and more complex. And this cartoon shows a French gentleman here. In some desperation, he is desperate to go to the loo. You can see here. What he didn't know is that to say you've had enough tea and you didn't want any more, you put your teaspoon in the cup. He didn't know that, so he put his empty cup and saucer down, now getting quite sizable, and then just refill it. and they'd refill it, and they'd refill it. And it finally says, after his 14th serving, in some agony and amusement to the others, their guest begs to be excused. So it was sending up people who didn't understand the rituals of taking tea. As can be seen from these goods and fashions, for much of the 18th century, tea was a luxury, in part due to the long and costly efforts to acquire it from more than halfway across the world. It was an expensive commodity in its own right. The Chinese strictly controlled its trade, permitting traders only into a single port at Canton, that's modern Guangzhou, which is in the news at the moment with the blank sheet protests going off there. They prohibited the removal of any living plants. They refused to allow bartering of any goods for tea of any sort whatsoever, and all payments had to be in silver and nothing else. Yep, despite these restrictions, the various East India companies from Holland, from Portugal, from Britain, from other countries, competed with each other to supply an insatiable desire for tea. In 1660, the first official British import record documented the arrival of 2 ounces of black tea. In 1706, a single dealer was selling green tea for the modern equivalent of £160 per 100 grams. By 1721, over £1 million, 450,000 kilograms of tea was being imported annually, and between 1751 and 1661, nearly £4 million of tea in weight a year was being imported. As its popularity grew, for a variety of reasons, tea became a source of taxation. Being a luxury, Dr. Short, Thomas of Sheffield, thought this was a good idea because he said it relieved the poor because only the rich could afford it. Then the rich were taxed and that was a good thing. It didn't quite work through that because it was taxed so much the poor couldn't afford it. But there you are. But taxation on tea was high. Various reasons for this. Water was not clean, and the staple safe drink for most of the population had been beer. Fearing a loss of trade, brewers campaigned for the tax to be high on tea, and that made it prohibitively expensive. The major importer of tea, the British East India Company, was initially seen as a vast, reliable business, but it nevertheless needed loans to expand. The government gave it loans. In return, it paid high rates of interest, paid good dividends, and so tea became a reliable source of taxation. By the early 1770s, Britain was consuming more tea than the rest of Europe combined, and the tax on tea alone generated 11% of total government revenue. Inevitably, this led to a huge increase in smuggling and foreign competition, which eventually began to reduce the cost of tea. New markets, notably that in America, were established, and they were bigger tea drinkers than we were, and they drank roughly twice as much as the British, and they were just as keen as we were to purchase all the equipage, the dress, the costume, the furniture to go with it. And America's increasing desire for tea and other British exports opened up the hope of new tax streams, not least to help to pay for the massively draining global 7 years war from 1756 to 1763. The British had tried to attack colonies before and had failed to do so. So in 1773, they came up with the Tea Act, and that was passed by the government to support, by now, a rather precarious East India Company that had expanded and expanded and expanded and was gobbling up more and more revenue by granting it a monopoly on tea sales in America. So far, so good. But that meant the tea was due to be paid tax on it, and the tax went to England. And you can see that where this was going with that famous phrase, no taxation without representation. Rockingham and his group of Rockingham Whigs here, particularly his friend and personal assistant Edmund Burke, campaigned against taxation. It's going to go nowhere. This is not going to work because it would be self-defeating. And in December of that year, 1773, American protests did erupt against taxation, resulting in the culmination of the Boston Tea Party. 250 years, it's 249 years, almost as today, 250 years next year. And that resulted with an angry Americans dumping 342 chests of tea belonging to the East India Company into Boston Harbour. It was worth about £9,600 to them. That would have meant several million pounds today. And across America, people stopped buying tea, and so the tax revenue plummeted. And this was picked up by British merchants and governors. They had never come across that ability for consumers to raise a protest and have an impact. And this was actually the very first known or documented consumer rebellion and expression of consumer power and opinion. And it was noted because the idea was later copied in England when trying to abolish the slave trade, they began to boycott the use of sugar. There were protests in all major towns, Sheffield being another example, where people were encouraged not to buy sugar to help bring an end to the slave trade. The Boston Tea Party was a significant contributor to the American Wars of Independence. Though not strong enough to carry them through, during his time as MP and Prime Minister, Lord Rockingham here and his Rockingham Whigs argued for trade concessions and peace with the colonies. That was not to say they didn't have wider appeal. In support of his friend and to show sympathy with the American colonists, the 3rd Earl of Effingham named his new shooting lodge, which, if it was daylight and probably not thick fog, you could just probably make out at the far end of the horizon, overlooking Rotherham, called it Boston Castle. Towards the end of the century, a range of problems prompted a dramatic turn of events for tea. The weakening of the East India Company, continuing problems in the colonies, price undercutting by smugglers, adulteration with sheep dung, ash leaves, potato peel, and I won't go into some of the other fillers because it just gets worse, and poor harvests decimating the wheat supplies for brewing, finally resulted in something called the Commutation Act, which slashed tax on all tea from 119% to 12.5%. Tea was available to all. And it may now be commonplace, but it still retained an association with more refined forms of behaviour. Tea drinking seemed to express enlightened forms of social behaviour, politeness, gentility, domestic virtue, tolerance, kindness. And you can see in this painting of a lady in quite sort of a poor setting, you can just make out she's got an open fire with a pot brewing water for tea, and on her side here she's got a broken dish and bowl, she's got bread and butter, an earthenware pots and things here, but she's got some nice silk gloves and a handkerchief drying over the fire there. Despite her poverty, she's being genteel. As with many other enterprises in Georgian England, taking tea could be seen from two angles. Its association with polite and genteel cultures, its ceremonies and expectations of considerate behaviour, are an example of the Georgians trying to take control and make sense of a rapidly expanding, volatile and often violent world. On the other side, the satirical cartoons showing mayhem, gossip, scandal, gossip, collapse of the moral order show tea as a vehicle to reflect contemporary fears as to how precarious life was and how quickly society could fall into chaos. So, What was tea taking like here? What impact did tea have on at Wentworth? Did it change the way people socialised? Was the thrill of its novelty shared by the household? Did they purchase its equipage? Did they take afternoon tea? Evidence relies on a variety of sources, including letters, inventories, plans, some from Wentworth Woodhouse and some from Wentworth Castle, which we don't really mention, but here it's quite useful. Despite their fragmentary nature, they do show a shared excitement in receiving this new material. They do reveal a concern in having the right equipment, and they do show a desire to offer new social occasions in a variety of locations, and actually just to show off. At the start of the 18th century, Thomas Wentworth Lord Raby, him over the hill, whose rejection as successor to this house caused the rival purchase and aggrandisement of Wentworth Castle, was ambassador to Prussia. He regularly corresponded with his family at home, and their letters reveal gifts of tea were received with great excitement and pride. This is his mother. And you can see here she's almost gabbling. She and her husband came this afternoon to see me, and Belle and hers and Peter and his boy, and it goes on and on and on and on and on. But, you only left me one teapot, the little blue and white one. She needed more tea goods. She hadn't quite got it right. And in other letters, this is Lord Raby here, she writes, and again it's that glee almost. I went as soon as I had dined and played at cards all day and had tea and coffee and cake and wine in the afternoon. And that's showing something that the paintings don't, that you didn't always just have tea. When you get the social discourse coming through, it's tea and wine and coffee and cake and all manner of things, not just bread and butter and tea going off. And again, Lord Shaftesbury came and showed us his gardens and all his ingenious contrivances and gave us fruit and French wine and sack and tea. She was having a pretty good time. And she's showing that it could be shown, tea could be taken in different scenarios. And she was eager to share and be quite giddy and excited about it. Now, her daughter-in-law, Strafford's wife of the second creation, Lady Strafford, slightly different approach to sharing this expensive luxury. I received this day £1 of tea directed to Our Lady Wentworth, his mother, one to Sister Betty, and £1 to myself, which I have this moment tasted and extremely good. I conclude theirs is not so good, but I'll keep that thought to myself. I received £2 of bohea tea by the messenger. He told me one was for Lady Wentworth in Russell Street, but I know she doesn't like Dutch tea, and I like it extremely, and so I think it the best I ever drunk, so I'll keep them both. So essential was tea to the advertisement of breeding and gentility and status that in 1732, Lord Raby, now as Thomas Wentworth, Earl Strafford, brackets, second creation, commissioned another artist, Gawain Hamilton, to show his family taking tea. So this is Lord Raby, garter band there, his family, in wonderful grand surroundings, taking tea. Over here at Wentworth Woodhouse, tea had become equally popular. On the death of the first Marquess of Rockingham in 1750, an inventory was taken, and it shows some of the wide range of tea goods available to guests here, depending upon their status and the place and the location. And you can see here, I don't know if you can make it out, but there's 4 flowered teapots, 34 teacups and saucers of different sorts, plates for teapots to stand on, sugar basins, cream pots, slop basins, more cups and saucers, and more cups and more slop basins of white china, china plates of different sorts, Delft teapots, mugs for coffee, mahogany trays, japanned hardboards. They'd got the lot. So tea could be consumed in a variety of rooms across the house, from drawing room to private closet or bedroom. But taking tea beyond the confines of the house, in especially created spaces, was a key feature of hospitality at Wentworth. And in 1750, Dr. Richard Pocock, who loved turning up at family houses and asked to be shown round. If some of you came to the last talk, you'd have heard about country visiting, described how he stayed here and toured the grounds. And he was shown a little house in which a bachelor might live, offices underground. We walked around the wood, drank tea and returned, and my lady engaged me to dine that day in the wood. And then he came round to the back of the house. That's our Baroque front, back front, west front, where at that time the obelisks which are around the monument were in the garden. And he carries on up and he says, on one side I saw a greenhouse and very pleasant pavilion with a room at the back of it. On the other side is the dairy, the poultry, and some rooms furnished where they used to dine and drink. And this is likely to be a description of the building we now know as the Camellia House and Lady Rockingham's tea rooms at the far west of the present grounds. And this group of buildings has undergone several alterations, and you can hear at the start of the talk how it's been developed now, and changes of use, and it's been variously described. It's been described as greenhouse, menagerie, pavilion, farm, tea room. And there are three areas that can still more or less be seen. That's the Grade 2 frontage there. That's been rebuilt in 1812, and that's currently undergoing extensive work, and that's where the camellias are grown, in there. And at the back, on the side, you can see here an earlier building, and this one, the architects Donald Insalls and other researchers have dated to about 1732. That's interesting. Remember, Dr. Thomas Short wrote his treatise in 1730. And here, at the back, you can just see starting there, is Lady Rockingham's tea room. And this has got a possibly earlier frontage that's been reused and rebuilt to make this tea room here. And a plan of 1740 shows the greenhouse here and the pavilion and menagerie and Lady Rockingham's tea rooms. Pavilions with menageries and sitting or entertaining areas from which to view animals or birds, such as this one at Wentworth, were very popular in the 18th century, and other examples can be found up and down the country, Combe Abbey, Stowe. And the 1778 Fairbanks map describes a menagerie and Lady Rockingham's tea room. Elsewhere in the grounds, an octagonal tea room was built around 1741, overlooking the ponds. This may now form part of the Mausoleum Lodge, and was possibly described in an inventory in 1750 as simply furnished, with one oval table and a large cover to it and 14 chairs. So anything you wanted to eat, drink down there, you had to take with you. The same inventory shows Lady Rockingham's tea room to have been far more sophisticated and well equipped. Kitchen, little parlour, middle room, feeding rooms, halls, dairy, mahogany tables, leather and rush-seated chairs, fire grates, toasting fork for comfort. The little parlour contained cups, saucers, plates, basins, all the things you wanted, including drinks for mead and wine, showing again that reflection from the house over the hill, how you would mix drinks. And here, Lady Mary and her friends could discuss matters of the day, as their blue-stocking compatriots did up and down the country, or admire the menagerie, or inspect the wider gardens. And that's some of the inventory details to Lady Rockingham's tea room there. And as we've said, the Camellia House is now going under extensive work to bring it back to life. Some of the camellias in it are possibly the earliest being introduced into Western Europe. That's perhaps late 18th century. There's a lot more research needed to go on. But they are immensely significant. And some of the species haven't been seen before in Europe. And so there's still lots of research to go into that. But this one species, Camellia sinensis, is that which triggered this worldwide revolution. And you can see here the two routes for tea, whether it went by sea or whether it went by land. Wherever it passed, it got a different name and a slightly different ritual and a slightly different culture. And those cultures and rituals are hoping to be shared in the Camellia House when it's completed. So if that's not enough to confirm the importance of tea to 18th century life and that of Wentworth, remember Dr. Thomas Short of Sheffield with a dissertation in 1730 on the properties, type and health benefits of tea. His wide-ranging dissertation is a key aid to helping us understand tea and the concerns of those drinking it for the first time in the 18th century. And it is dedicated to the Right Honourable Thomas Lord Moulton, Knight of the Bath, and his commentary is an attempt to address questions raised by the Right Honourable and truly noble Mary, Lady Moulton, shortly to become the Marquess and Marquess Lady Mary Rockingham of Wentworth Woodhouse. Perhaps this was the idea and inspiration for a tea room. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was so informative. There's how many weeks, months of research went into that?
Far too long.
A lot. We've time for a few questions. Would anybody like to ask Julie anything about the lecture tonight? Just let me pass you the mic.
I know I've got a big voice and it's quite loud. Did the opening of the tea trade with India bring the price down and make it available to the masses? Was that an influence?
To some extent, but the Indian tea trade didn't open up until the 1840s. So tea had become established and the price had come down. It was really the Commutation Act that dropped the tax from 119% to 12.5% that made it widely available to everyone. And just the sheer amount, that phrase, all the tea in China, it's not that old a phrase, but at one point, the Dutch East India Company thought they could corner the market and just get all the tea in China and develop and bring it to Europe and sell it at a high rate. But it was just swamped. So it did help, but not until the mid-19th century.
Any more questions?
You got your tea clipper ships and the racing those back.
That's one of the things I mentioned, but I thought that we're going on too much. Yeah, the actual race to get tea back from China did change the development of racing ships. And the Atlantic races we have today were originally established with those tea clippers racing each other to get across the Atlantic with their trade to America first. So it had a massive influence on ship design.
I'd just like to ask about the rituals of tea. Which goes first, the milk or the tea?
Sorry?
The milk or the tea, which goes first?
Well, you could get into serious trouble here. Auburn War and the Bloomsbury set, I've got to get this right now, milk in last. If you were of the lower orders, it was milk in first. Discuss. I'm not getting involved.
Carrying on from that, was that something to do with the quality of the porcelain?
Sorry, what's the...
The quality of the porcelain and whether it would crack if hot?
Yeah, some people say that's not true. But getting the warming the pot, that phrase, I think there had been problems with pots just breaking. Maybe they'd got cracked being brought across when they were the original Chinese goods, or that cheaper tin porcelain paste didn't work so well. So yeah, they did have this tradition of warming the pot, which we still do very often today. And it probably came from fear of damaging this delicate porcelain.
So the camellia plants, how much tea does like a typical camellia plant like what they have
How
in the
much
house?
tea?
Does one of those plants produce, say, in a year? And are they going to be serving any of the tea from the plants in the house?
I think the straight answer to that's no. There tends to be this one particular species, Camellia sinensis, but depending on the climate and the soil and how it's grown, it grows massively differently. So that's one aspect. How frequently it's pruned back, depending on the type of tea they want it to produce. So it might just be a shrub, or it might be about 2 or 3 meters high, is another aspect of how many leaves it will produce. But you would need far more than the trees we've got, even though there are 19, to make more than a pound or so of tea. And then they had to be dried, roasted, broken up, and there was a huge performance in making the tea. So it would be lovely to make tea from our shrubs, but I don't think it's going to happen.
Tips, you're constantly plucking the top tips off the things that they can harvest all year round.
Yeah, yes.
As they grow again.
Okay, one more question.
You mentioned that China controlled the production of tea originally. What changed that they allowed the rest of the world to actually...
They didn't really. I think 2 things happened. One is that they only insisted on being paid in solid silver, and so silver was just flooding out of Europe. And then 2 things happened. They switched silver and began to offer opium, which is a whole new discussion. And then as time progressed, they first of all tried to smuggle plants out, but then discovered native species in India. And the first 2 areas of India where tea was cultivated was Darjeeling and Assam. And that changed the market. And now most of our tea is from India and other countries.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your interest. Thank you so much for the lecture, Julie. That was absolutely brilliant. I believe that's our last lecture for this year, and we start again in January with a lecture on the country house and Georgian politics. But for tonight, can I just ask you to put your hands together once again? Dr. Julie Banham, thank you.